So welcome to the Sporty's webinar presentation on Airline Pilot's Guide to Fearless Propeller Flying. This is part 2 on flight planning. Now, before you step away, not to worry. If you did not tune in or did not engage with part 1, you can always come back to part 1. So we'll talk more about part 1 in just a second. On behalf of Sporty's Pilot Shop, welcome. My name is Eric Radtke, your co-host and facilitator this evening. And before we introduced our other host for this evening, and really the power behind the power and the brains behind tonight's presentation, which is Captain Abend, I just wanted to take you through a few quick housekeeping items before we get too far. And number 1 is, and we always get this question, we are recording tonight's presentation. So I'll answer this question in advance. If you have to step away or you miss a specific point that was made, not to worry. You can always come back and view and review as much as you'd like. And within about 24 hours, we'll have the full recording posted on the Sporty's YouTube channel and also in the webinar archives at sportys.com/webinar. So a big thank you to Sporty's Pilot Shop for hosting tonight's or supporting tonight's presentation. You're welcome to participate as you would like. So the GoToWebinar software that you're working in does give you the ability to submit questions. So we won't have necessarily live Q&A, although we hope to be able to respond to a few questions towards the end of the presentation. Please feel free anytime to submit those questions via the software. And even if we don't get to your specific question, we'll attempt to come back, even if it's a slightly later time, and respond to any of those questions. And related to that, if you think of something after the presentation that you wanted to present to Captain Abend or myself, you can always email us at cfi@sportys.com, and we'll be able to address those as well. Without further ado, indeed my pleasure to introduce my friend and co-host for this evening, American Airlines retired, current contributing editor of Flying Magazine, Captain Abend. And I was just found out very recently that Captain Abend actually has some other educational activity that he just recently started participating in. So I'm hoping we can get him to tell us a little about that. Les, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Well, glad to be here, Eric. I appreciate your assistance in this whole thing. And for those folks that didn't tune in the last time, the purpose of this webinar was just to kind of entice people and get people involved that are airline types and even instructors that might be teaching airline pilots involved back in general aviation, or if you'd never had been in general aviation as a military pilot, to come back and not be scared of flying a propeller airplane or getting in the general aviation environment. There's a lot involved, but the purpose of this was so that you're all professional pilots as airline folks, but there's some concerns and some trepidation about airspace and various things that wanted to just get you involved with if you're making that consideration to come back to general aviation. And rather than going through a private pilot handbook of aeronautical knowledge and starting a whole private pilot course to get you up to speed, we wanted to get you more acclimated, knowing some of the airline perspective, at least what I knew as a general aviation pilot and as an airline pilot. And then in regard to Eric, your inquiry as to what I'm doing now all of a sudden in instruction, for those that are interested, I decided to come out of retirement after 2.5 years and actually do full-time work. Monday through Friday, which is a little frightening, but in any case, I'm working for Simcom, which is primarily a corporate jet training facility, and I'm in the initial cadre for the G650, the Gulfstream 650. So there you go. You're up to date. Thank you, everybody, for showing up, and let me hand the show back to Eric.
So I know it looks like, Les, we have some curious participants. They want to know about your background there in the room that you're in right now, and what flight deck are we looking at there?
Okay, well, it happens to be one of the West Wind models, and I would be remiss if I actually knew which one it was, but it's a West Wind model, and anyhow, it was one of the rooms that was available. So, and it's not the airplane I'm training on.
Well, thank you for that.
It just has good Wi-Fi, Eric. That's why.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this, Les. Certainly, here at Sporty's, it seems like we are feeling just some really good positive energy behind general aviation and light airplane flying. And thank you for pointing out that, you know, one of your goals in envisioning this type of presentation was to give some confidence to some individuals getting back into light airplane flying. So, you know, tell me from your perspective, or, you know, in your writing, in your active GA flying, do you feel that kind of, you know, renewed energy? I know it's the right time of year for something like that.
No, absolutely. And you know, with this pandemic thing still ongoing, it gives us the opportunity to go places that don't involve TSA, don't involve you know, our social distancing problems and masks, and we can kind of regulate that on our own. I did it, as a matter of fact. My wife and I elected not to do our normal ski trip, and we went with a friend, JetBlue captain. As a matter of fact, I'll promote a column that I just wrote. But we for the sole purpose of not having to deal with airports and the social distancing and the masking and the risk of COVID, we went in a Cessna 180 all the way from Florida to Colorado. So it just there's still a lot of enthusiasm out there for general aviation, and there's still people with enough funds to keep it going.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And, you know, as everyone just heard, pick up the most recent edition of Flying Magazine and make sure to follow along with Captain Abend's column. It's one that I certainly never miss. You know, always something interesting, intriguing to read about. Much less interesting, just very quickly, again, Eric Radtke, and I oversee the educational division at Sporty. So from my perspective in providing you this information tonight, you know, I have the pleasure and privilege of working and talking very regularly to individuals that are probably a lot like many of you right now, and that are either, you know, spent some time in the airline, maybe you're an instructor working with pilots that have some previous airline experience. And even though we'll offer some of that perspective, again, if you're here and have no airline experience, but you've just been away from aviation or just thinking about getting started, there's going to be plenty, I think, that you'll find valuable about tonight's presentation. And again, you can always reach me at cfi@sportys.com. So just kind of table of contents so you know what topics we'll be exploring. And our goal, even with these topics, is not to cover every element in extreme detail. It's only to kind of scratch the surface and hopefully give you some things to think about, and hopefully that will maybe trigger your curiosity a bit more, and you'll decide that within these individual topics there's some areas that you want to dive into a little bit deeper. So that's kind of our goal, give you some confidence, give you some additional things to think about, and pique your curiosity on many of these. But, you know, in terms of flight planning, we're going to talk about, you know, making that very first decision of what type of rules we're going to fly under, whether that's going to be visual or instrument, IFR, VFR. As Les mentioned, we're going to talk a little about airspace and certainly not bore you to death, but remind you a little bit about those airspace, terminal airspace elements that you need to think about. Some flight planning considerations, you know, what it takes, you know, to plan for a fuel stop and what you should be thinking about amenities at a given airport that you might choose to land. Of course, aviation and weather go hand in hand, and for us light airplane flyers flying low level, we have to contend with you know, weather-related issues on a regular basis. So we want to make sure you have the tools and resources in order to be able to do that, and then also some en route resources. And there's a lot of great new technology that's making things a lot easier for us, so we can be better informed. So, you know, that very first question when it comes to flight planning, should I go IFR or VFR? So what we want to do in that, and we can't answer that necessarily for you, but give you some things to think about when it comes to deciding which path you're going to take. Now, the most obvious is probably weather. And if you can't stay VFR, and that's not necessarily abiding by those very specific minimum visibility requirements like 3 miles and staying 500 feet below the clouds, you know, that's staying safe. So that's making sure you have good positive VFR weather if that's what you choose to do. And if not, you know, maybe it's time to start thinking about going under instrument flight rules. It also relates to the type of equipment. No two aircraft are created equally. So if you are going to fly IFR, you know, you want to make sure not only your aircraft is properly equipped from a legal perspective, but properly equipped again to take advantage of some of the modern technology to make your IFR flying safer, especially again if you're thinking about some single pilot operations as opposed to maybe coming from a two pilot airplane. Also, distance plays a lot into that, and that also, you know, brings in additional weather considerations the further the distance you are going. We always as pilots need to be thinking about, you know, what our competencies are for a given flight. If I'm going to fly IFR, you have to be prepared to work within the system, and certainly if the weather dictates, perhaps, you know, execute an instrument approach procedure. And if that's not something you're doing on a regular basis, you want to make sure you're confident in doing so. And also maybe the complexities of airspace. Les, some things you would add to that from your perspective on considerations of VFR and IFR.
Well, number one, remember, this is fun. This is something that you want to do. This is you know, getting back to your roots if you had GA roots. If you're former military, this is a new challenge for you, but it's a fun challenge, and you have to be at a comfort level for where you get to. I always recommend, you know, get with a flight instructor that's very familiar with, as Eric is, with all of these items that we'll be discussing today. But always remember, as you did as an airline pilot, don't go beyond your comfort level. You have to challenge yourself, but don't go beyond that comfort level.
So in terms of a VFR selection, you know, and some of the differences, and it's interesting in some of the individuals I talk to, Les, it's, you know, maybe coming from an airline background when you've been flying on a regular basis and doing nothing but IFR flying, you know, maybe the term VFR gives you some hesitation or some trepidation, but yet I see it the other way too, where there are pilots that are fearful of that IFR environment. So it certainly depends, and you could be on, you know, either side of that. But for a VFR selection, of course, what you're going to get to experience and enjoy is a lot of flexibility in altitudes that you're going to fly and routing that you're going to fly. You're ultimately responsible. Really, everyone's responsible, of course, for the see and avoid concept. But you're responsible for obstacle clearance and really keeping a watchful eye on you know, everything you're doing in the airplane, because you don't have the benefit of ATC watching over and being responsible for that separation of traffic. You do have to keep yourself legal, of course, from you know, from a VFR standpoint, and making sure you're always observing those minimum rules. But I guess a point I'd like to illustrate, and unless I'm sure you'd agree, you know, we define VFR loosely by that 3 miles minimum visibility. But if you're not a customer, haven't flown in 3 miles of visibility in a while, you'd probably be shocked at how little that really is. And so I'd certainly caution you, if you intend to fly down towards those marginal conditions, anything less than 5 miles, you know, in my opinion, you really should be thinking about IFR, or at least ensuring that you're proficient for IFR. You know, most of that flying you'll be doing is in Class E airspace, as opposed to those terminal environments, you know, where that legal minimum is 3, but I'd certainly encourage something much more greater than that. And the same goes with fuel requirements. From a legal perspective, you have to have at least 30 minutes of fuel, but that's very little when you're talking about maybe giving some weather a wide berth. Les, would you agree with that in terms of those conservative minimums?
Oh, absolutely. And I think really the ultimate goal, you know, for airline pilots, you know, aside from getting the proficiency, is to be able to have the flexibility to, and we'll be talking about it, is to go IFR. You know, VFR is a lot of fun. You know, if you're talking about buying a tail dragging airplane that, you know, is primarily a VFR machine, that's another story. But if you've got an IFR capable airplane, it's always nice to, once again, we go back to the comfort level of knowing that you can potentially file IFR. But really the fun of this GA is to be able to see and take passengers with you so that they can see and enjoy the scenery.
Absolutely, well said. Now, from an IFR perspective, of course, you know, you're going to, while you may file a specific route, a preferred route of sorts, you're ultimately at the mercy of air traffic control and the altitude assignments, the routing assignments that they provide. So a little less flexibility when it comes to that. You know, by the same token, when we talk flexibility, if you're IFR, you know, that just gives you a few more options. You know, you don't necessarily have to be as dialed in to cloud clearance requirements, for example, or boxing yourself into a situation where you're looking for holes to come down. So certainly, flexibility in the type of conditions you're flying in from an IFR perspective, it really gives you a little more utility there, I would say. Now, when you're the IFR, flying can be a demanding environment. You're expected to, maintain specific altitudes and headings. That's all to, avoid other traffic. So there's, some school of thought there that, you may be susceptible to, making mistakes that could, get you into some trouble. Now, I would, I guess, counter that by saying that if you're proficient, if you're well trained, that should not be a major factor. But something else to consider in that IFR environment is, departure and arrival procedures. So if you're going into some busier airspace, you could have to contend with departure and arrival procedures. Again, maybe give some pilots hesitations, but those are just, standard routes to help the efficient flow of traffic in and out. And from a fuel planning perspective, you always have to have at least 45 minutes of fuel reserve there, and if an alternate is required, you have to have 45 minutes plus that. Les, your thoughts on kind of those nuances of IFR flying?
Well, one of the things, I mean, IFR flying is great, and I tend to do that, a lot. If I'm going, especially long distance, it takes a lot of the focus or the worry out of things. But at the same time, you got to remember you're not the priority like you were before up in the stratosphere. It's a different environment to some respect, and they'll certainly help you if you've got issues with weather situations, convective weather, or potential icing. ATC will jump on it right away. But your routing is not going to be exactly what you is not going to exactly be direct. So you're going to spend a little bit more money in fuel, but sometimes it's well worth it.
Great point, and related to ATC, an excellent point, and being just another resource. Even VFR flying, you still have the option. We're going to talk about that a little later, of getting VFR services from ATC, which could be a little bit, kind of the best of both worlds, so to speak. A few more things you may consider in the IFR environment that maybe if you're coming from the airline world, you certainly are accustomed to departure procedures out of the major terminal environments. But you have to think, when you're going into smaller, lighter GA flying, one of those additional freedoms that we have in the GA world is access to more airports, right? Very capable aircraft that can go into smaller airfields, maybe closer to where you ultimately want to be without all the congestion. And a lot of those airports, of course, though, while they may have instrument approach procedures, they're probably, in most cases, not going to have those standard arrival and departures. So you have to kind of think ahead or plan ahead how we're going to transition out of the terminal environment to the en route environment. And there's plenty of resources that we have available to us to help us with that, but just understand they might not always be there. And again, from an alternate perspective, the regulations are very prescriptive, and in the airline world, a dispatch office to perhaps help you along and identify valid alternates. So in terms of additional IFR considerations, you have to think about the legal requirements for an alternate, which in a general sense is looking at whether an hour before or hour after your planned time of arrival, and essentially if it's not VFR weather, you have to be thinking about an alternate. But again, last, in terms of being conservative, I would certainly advocate for always having an alternate, if not filed, at least having an alternate in mind. And I know one thing that you can, help share some good perspective on, Les, is the fact that, most GA pilots are probably accessing FAA charts as opposed to Jeppesen charts, which I know in your days with American Airlines, you were essentially exclusive Jeppesen.
Correct. Yeah, and it's a little different transition, and it's worth the time to just look at those charts, make sure you understand all the little notes and the nitnoid details that were on our Jeppesen charts. But it's not a difficult transition. It's just a transition. And hey, listen, at the end of the day, NOS charts are free. Jeppesen is a very expensive subscription. They're certainly worth it, but I stick to the NOS charts. They're understandable. I get them. I don't miss a lot of information. But just back off on the subject of departures. you know, a lot of the situational awareness will be in your lap. If you haven't already experienced this on your own, is that if you've got terrain issues and you don't necessarily have a departure procedure, that's a consideration you want to give. You don't have the jet performance that you had prior, so you're going to be taken off perhaps in a hot day in the summer, and although trees wouldn't be an issue to you in a jet, you know, the tree at the end of the runway may actually be an issue if you have to depart IFR. And the other aspect, I think, and I don't want to take the wind out of your sails, Eric, but the other aspect to departures, you know, how are you going to get airborne and how are you going to get your clearance? It's kind of a fun experience. You may have to call an ATC facility on the phone. A lot of the apps that we'll discuss in a little bit do have that opportunity where you can call directly to a tower and they'll give you the clearance, and you have to deal with a void time, which is kind of fun. So do you do your run up before you ask for the clearance? You know, is the void time 10 minutes from now, 5 minutes from now? And can you use your headset, your Bluetooth headset, to talk rather than pulling your headset off and using your iPhone to make the call? So those are some silly little considerations, which can be fun considerations, but something that you know that you've probably never come across in the airline flying.
I'm glad you pointed that out. That's absolutely fun. I mean, fun exploring new things if you haven't, you know, done a few of these things, and you know, understand that, you know, the folks on the other end at air traffic control, they're people just like me and you, and you know, people make mistakes, and you know, it's fun to try out some of these things and be confident in doing so, and you know that you know, be confident in being able to get it figured out for sure. But I'm glad you mentioned the fun part. Les, one other element I wanted to ask you about related to some of these additional IFR considerations. You know, you talked about taking the trip with your friend from JetBlue. So you're flying together, and I assume at some point, while not maybe as formal as your airline days, maybe one or the other was serving in some more traditional co-pilot duties. So, you know, I guess one thing I would point out is, even if you've stepped away from the formalized professional two-pilot crew, that doesn't mean, just like you did with your friend, that you can't bring a friend along and serve in somewhat of a supporting, you know, role.
No, absolutely. I mean, it was a dangerous cockpit with two airline pilots, you know, in the front end. You know, despite what our wives said, but no, we shared the responsibility, you know, with radio calls and various things, and we had, you know, an instance where we shared a decision process, you know, aeronautical decision making at its finest. In the column, I mentioned a weather situation, and the hairs on the back of our neck stood up. So we both together almost, you know, unilaterally said, let's not go there, and we diverted. And no, it's important. And even if it's your spouse in that right seat, there's a lot that individual can do to help you out and act as your co-pilot, and make it fun for that individual as well.
And make it fun, absolutely. So, you know, talking about, you know, how it's working kind of in the real world of light airplane flying, and in reality, what you're going to experience, I think, even if you are flying IFR, what you'll find is a lot of flights, if not most flights, are going to be some combination of VFR and IFR. So again, if you're coming from the airline world, you're typically accustomed to receiving an IFR clearance probably before you push back, and the IFR doesn't cancel until you land at your destination. Well, you know, in and out of smaller airports, non-towered airports, pilot-controlled airports, if you will, you know, oftentimes it's a lot more efficient, and even the system really depends on it for efficiency in order to move more airplanes in and out, for you to, you know, employ some combination of both. So you may be flying IFR, but you may opt, and ATC may even prompt you to, you know, cancel your IFR clearance before you get all the way to the destination, because it can be, as long as the weather supports it, a little cumbersome and just one extra step to have to cancel an IFR flight plan if you don't have a tower there on the field once you land. So that can be good for the system. And the same with departures. You know, oftentimes it's going to take some extra time to retrieve an IFR clearance if you're sitting on the ground, but if the weather supports it, there's nothing to say that you can't depart VFR, especially a non-towered airport, and leave the area, get up to the en route environment, and call ATC and pick up that IFR clearance. Again, the system really depends on it for efficiency. And unless I know you just referenced some different ways you can pick up IFR clearances, so we can kind of dive right into that topic. You mentioned the fact that nowadays that many of the modern flight planning apps are giving you telephone numbers. So you may have experienced that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's become a little, usually it's sort of a Google search, but now all these apps are giving a specific place on airport info on who to call for a clearance. So it makes it a lot easier. And it's really just like reading a clearance like we did professionally. You're just reading it over the phone, and it really makes life easier. That's my preference. I mean, a lot of folks will depart VFR just to get the show on the road, which if you have a VFR situation, clearly, that's not an issue. But then again, if you're the only pilot flying the airplane and you're writing down a clearance and trying to, climb up to altitude, it can be problematic. And so it's a consideration to have. Like I said, my preference is to have the clearance. Void time, I never really have a problem with a void time. And even if I make it past the void time or go past the void time and get airborne, they're going to fit me into the system regardless. But I do my best, and most void times are easy to comply with.
That's a great point. And so give yourself a wide berth. In other words, if you are going to depart VFR with the intent to pick up an IFR clearance, make sure you have good weather, time, make sure you have a frequency in mind so that you're not, task saturated by the time you're looking to pick up that clearance. So just to recap, a few options that you have is departing VFR, contacting air traffic control once you're in the air, or also on the ground using one of those telephone numbers, which is now published in a lot of cases for the ATC facilities, which is preferred. I mean, there's still the old-fashioned way of contacting flight service, but by calling directly, you're just eliminating that middle person, because all this flight service is going to do is serve as a relay between the ATC facility and your actual airplane. So you're kind of saving a step if you contact the facility directly, as Les just mentioned. Now en route, there's a couple of tools, a couple of resources, and even clearance types that I really personally think are greatly underutilized in our light airplane GA flying below 18,000 feet. And these are a combination VFR and IFR en route, and one of those being VFR on top. So if it's been a while since you've heard the term, page through the AIM, I know that's probably not high on your list, but VFR on top is an actual IFR clearance that allows you to fly at a VFR cruise altitude. And the reason you would do something like this is to stay out of the weather. It's certainly no fun low level. We've probably all experienced it at some point, bouncing around in the cloud tops. So, you still have to inform ATC of the specific altitude you're flying at, but you can pick a VFR cruise altitude and stay out of that weather, but still not give up the IFR clearance entirely for when you maybe have to come back through some clouds. As an alternate to that, if you did want to give up IFR completely, you certainly are permitted to fly VFR on top of a cloud layer, on top of a ceiling or an overcast layer. But certainly a word of caution is that you don't want to get yourself trapped. At some point you have to come back down. In the unlikely event of an emergency, you maybe have a fewer options if you're on that VFR only clearance over the clouds. And unless I think you've done some of this, maybe even recently, has done some of this VFR flying as part of an IFR clearance.
Well, yeah, I have, and I guess I keep referring back to that, that trip I had with my JetBlue captain friend, and he asked me to request VFR on top, and I gave him a little cross-eyed look, and he understood it a lot better than I did. And what was cool about it was that we were experiencing some pretty high-level winds. We were watching the semis pass us, which you'll experience in this. If you do some VFR flying, in GA. But in any case, because of the high level winds, we were experiencing a bumpy ride. And the best way to do it was to try to, even though we weren't on a top situation or weren't in a cloud layer situation, we were able to climb to VFR altitudes and get out of some of that bumpy ride situation. So it worked really well. work really well.
Excellent. Now on the back end, for all the same reasons we've said, you'll often again experience this combination if you're filing IFR. And a few options that you have in the terminal environment is conducting a visual approach, which doesn't cancel your IFR. That's an IFR clearance, but allows you to proceed visually to the airport, or completely canceling your IFR clearance and just proceeding in VFR. And that can often be, if there is some weather in the area, a little bit of a tough decision. Now, what are some, I'll ask Captain Abend here, what are some of the factors that might weigh into your decision of whether you're going to cancel IFR or go on some kind of visual IFR clearance?
Yeah, good segue, and I'll give you a little anecdotal story, because I've found all sorts of ways to screw up in GA and recover safely from it. But the anecdotal story is I was coming back to our home base and faced with that very decision, and in the back of my head I said, I really should request the whole approach, because there were rain showers in the vicinity, and but they were pushing me for a visual, and their weather was not updated. And I've learned my lesson from this for this particular facility, but it was a little touch and go. So I stuck with their suggestion that expect a visual when I should have requested the RNAV approach, and it turned out, that had I waited a little bit longer, I would have been in a tougher situation. I certainly could have got out of it by requesting the approach, but I would have been better off going ahead with the entire procedure, the IFR procedure and the approach.
So, be cautious, would be the, I guess, takeaway in that, in terms of, canceling completely. I want to shift gears to airspace. And, you will, is a GA flyer, a low altitude flyer, have to get yourself reacquainted or better acquainted with kind of the alphabet airspace that we probably remember from the private pilot days, the B, C, D, and even E surface areas that we're accustomed to. So it's the B, C, and Ds that are associated with a tower facility, and B starts with kind of the busiest, the highest volume terminal areas, what you find in Atlanta or Miami or Chicago or New York, etc. And then it kind of goes down from there to C and D. All have, some minor differences in rules, but just understand, in order to operate in any of those surface areas, you need to make sure that you are talking to air traffic control, and certainly that they're aware of you. And with the case of Class B, the slight difference there, you actually need permission even flying VFR. And in all those I just mentioned, other than the Class D and E and the C and B, that is one of those new ADS-B requirement areas. So you could develop a whole course around the alphabet airspace, and encourage you to review that. And to kind of help things, I added in the handout section in the GoToWebinar platform, you'll find a nice graphic there that shows all the alphabet airspace and the different VFR weather requirements and the different equipment requirements. Les, how was that transition for you to kind of getting reacquainted for all the alphabet airspace?
Well, I'll never get them down, as well as you do, Eric. But here's the relief for the airline pilots that are going. I'll never remember what Class C is and Class D and all that. You go to your iPad and whatever app you may have, ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot, WingX, whatever it is. If you touch within the airport airspace area, it will tell you where that class airspace is. So, or for your flight planning purposes, so am I going to be above it? Am I going to be, below it? So some of the brain work is, you can wipe your forehead now. Some of the brain work is going to be out of that. So that's the great thing about having these aviation apps.
No, just a great point there. It seems like we, and I would underscore this point to anyone coming back, it's much less than it even was 5-10 years ago about memorizing rules, but more about where do I go to find the information. And as you point out, with these iPad device, electronic flight bag, it's all right there. So it's just a matter of getting to the information. Not that you're going to have to take a written test on this again. And the same can be said for the special use airspace. We'll touch on a few of the highlights and things you'll encounter most often, but you'll see these military operation areas, which are essentially just practice areas for military training activity. if you're flying IFR and these MOAs are active, these are areas where you can't enter, an ATC would steer you clear of those specific areas. If you're VFR, you kind of enter at your own risk, of course, and it's all see and avoid, but there's no issue with doing that. And again, the apps, as Les pointed out, they make it real easy, much easier at getting the information on the specific special use area and who the controlling facility is and when it might be active. You also may come across these alert areas, which are the blue barbs on the visual charts if you haven't looked in quite some time. And those alert areas, which are becoming more prevalent, especially with a lot of good energy and GA, a lot of training activity. These alert areas are usually created when there's a real high volume of activity that you should be aware of. And just kind of on down the list of some additional special use airspace, not a full list, but prohibit areas are definitely one, whether IFR or VFR, that you need to avoid. And restricted areas, are restricted only at certain times. So the difference there in prohibited, restricted, prohibited is prohibited typically at all times, but restricted is usually only prohibited at specific times. And again, you can always contact the controlling agencies. And unless I know, as you're flying around and just like me nowadays, you can just kind of tap and get all those details, which makes it much more easy.
Yeah, you can get a hold of the controlling agency. The restricted areas are the ones that you're going to be primarily concerned with. The prohibited area, one of the ones that the famous one is, the one over Washington. That even in and of itself, that's encompassed by a pretty large zone, and most of us airline people want to stay away from that in VFR situation. But there's a training course that can be taken through AOPA, and you get a little tiny certificate that you've taken the course, and that's a prerequisite for flying through it. But it's still doable. Me personally, I'd probably go IFR, and that takes a lot of the worry out of it. But there's still some other aspects about flying IFR into it that you do have to comply with. But that being said, it's not the daunting situation that maybe you'd be fearing.
So and that's that Washington area that Les talks about that has the course available, that started out as just a temporary flight restricted area, or TFR, and turned into something a little more permanent. But the TFR still can pop up and still exist really all over. And one of the more notable versions of a TFR is something that follows the president, and we refer to that as a presidential TFR. So when the president travels, this protected airspace kind of follows. So again, these can move around quite a bit, and you typically don't get a ton of notice on when they're going to be active, perhaps a couple of days in advance. But that's another benefit of flying with some of the electronic flight bag equipment and flight planning apps, is that they can oftentimes present this information. And then there's another kind of blanket restricted area that we kind of contend with this day and age, and that's prohibiting aircraft from flying directly over large sports stadiums. So those can also be charted, but you generally have to have a pretty good awareness. Now, the restriction is not all that overbearing or overwhelming. It's only just 3,000 feet in the air in a 3-mile radius, so it's generally a pretty small area. So not something to be overly concerned with, but certainly something to have an awareness of. Now, shifting gears for a second to flight planning, certainly Captain Abend has referenced it before, but boy, the technology has just made not only identifying airspace areas and contacting agencies and hours of operations, but the whole flight planning process is become so much more visual and so much easier to build out. So in other words, work smart, not hard. A lot of great electronic flight bag apps out there that do a lot of things for you. Les, would you agree with that?
Well, first of all, that slide is going to scare a lot of my colleagues with that plotter sitting there, and that's actually a sectional chart that you don't get to see, and I believe that's a HP computer with a calculator and so on. So
a little nostalgia.
None of that has to be used. It's all iPad, and you don't have to multiply the arm times the moment and put that chart together unless you really enjoy doing that. But in any case, like you said, Eric, it's you put in a generic airplane. I think we'll discuss this a little bit, but you put in your type of airplane, and it pretty much helps you fill in the blanks. That's all you really have to do.
Yeah, so to give you kind of a taste of what you can experience in these very capable apps, and this just happens to be an excerpt from ForeFlight, but there are a lot of great applications out there, Garmin Pilot, Flight Plan Go, ForeFlight, whatever the case may be. So, you can spend a lot of time on your own kind of sorting through and reading reviews, etc. I will say that ultimately the apps very much do the same thing. How you interface with them is going to be a little different. Just like there's room in the world for Pepsi and Coke, there's room for multiple applications. So my advice would be, most of these providers let you download their apps for free and take free test drives. So download a couple and create some phony flights, do some chair flying, and see kind of how you interact or what type of interface you lean towards. And that's probably the application for you. This happens to be ForeFlight that you're seeing on the screen, and this is a flight, potentially from Asheville down to Hilton Head in the southeast. And this is just kind of an example of how everything has become so visual, so that you can see, anticipate where weather challenges or issues might be. In the case that you're not going to go direct, which might be if you're going to file IFR, these applications will even give you suggestions based on other pilots having filed the same route or ATC having issued the same clearance. So you can kind of visualize and decide for yourself what routing might work best for you, as long as you've inputted all of your aircraft profile information accurately. It has to be good information in, of course, to get the good information out. But the kind of the application itself will work its magic in the background and do many of these calculations for you, including weight and balance information, as you can kind of see on the screen. Performance profiles are often stored in many of these apps. So when it comes to inputting data, it's not like you're grabbing the POH and having to type through a bunch of different true airspeed and power settings, etc. A lot of this will be there for you, and you can simply click on a specific profile you want to use. And in the case of ForeFlight and many others, they even give you the option to modify slightly those performance profiles, make speed adjustments, whatever the case may be, and then kind of in the end, be able to give you this, very informative, in this case, weight and balance picture, and ultimately this very comprehensive flight plan output with headings and altitudes and ground speeds and various checkpoints. So Les, it's all magic kind of to me, but it seems to work. Is that your experience?
Listen, with my big heavy hyper aero, I still do it. I put in the numbers, and it's simple. You just input the numbers, and if you've got a question about your loading, as using weight and balance as an example, it just works wonders, and it makes you it helps your comfort level knowing that you've loaded the airplane right or kept it under limits.
A testament to the GA community in general. I mean, so much of this data is available because we all like to participate. We all help each other. So don't reinvent the wheel, right? All that data is there. It's been tested and proved over and over again. So that's why these performance profiles have become so accurate. Now, one thing that these apps won't necessarily do, because it's such a personal decision and experience, is planning for stops. So, I can say for me personally that most GA aircraft, you can put enough fuel on and go far enough that the airplane itself is going to be able to go a lot further than I can go personally from a comfort perspective. And not only myself, but I often fly with other people. I often fly with family, and I want them to love general aviation as much as I do. So I try to keep them comfortable, and that means give them plenty of breaks. So, when it comes to planning a little bit longer of a flight, keep in mind that airplane range is not necessarily the range that you want to consider. Think about passenger comfort. And then, if you do plan an intermediate stop, so many great airports and so many great places to see and things to do. but always think ahead a little bit, because no two FBOs are built the same way. So you don't want surprises. None of us like surprises in aviation. So we want to know what's available on the ground when we get there, when the FBO is going to be open. And certainly at a lot of the airports that I frequent, Les, and you're probably seeing this too, we're seeing a lot of self-serve fueling options now. So maybe you don't need to necessarily be concerned with someone there to man the fuel truck.
Yeah, I try to pick airports with self-serve, although I on occasion, if I find a different system, I'm arguing with it between that pulling out the hose and the static line. But after a while, you kind of get it. But the other aspect to what you were talking about, well, with my wife and I, 3 hours is about the time limit. We need to be on the ground for bladder reasons and so on and so forth. But when you do your trip planning, it's important. If you're going to find an airport out in the middle of nowhere, maybe find out if they have a crew car, if it's about lunchtime. I've had some experiences, and as gracious as the FBO is with crew cars, that, maybe you don't want to take your spouse in, but sometimes you don't know till you arrive. But it's all part of the fun. It's all part of the experience. But do keep that, that's something to keep in mind, that when you plan your fuel stops, and I like to really call them bladder stops, that you do it, at a place that at least has the facilities that you can do the minimum in any case. If not, find a way to get to lunch.
Absolutely. And one, I'm sure you'll appreciate this, Les, a personal story, and this happened to me recently, in trying to explore ground transportation options. In the case of this airport, I was going to checked on a crew car first. There wasn't going to be a crew car available, but it just kind of goes to show that a little local knowledge goes a long way. So I was able to actually talk to a person at the FBO, and they were able to, even though when I was looking at the possibility of an Uber or a Lyft, the app kind of indicated that nothing would be available, but this person on the ground was able to say, well, we have a person in town. If you call him directly ahead of time, he will actually log in to Lyft, I think it was, and he'll sign in and he'll go ahead and complete your ride. So don't give up, I guess, is one point I would make. Again, try to maybe get some local knowledge before you bypass a specific stop, and there's some great insight I think you can gain from that.
There's a lot. That's part of the fun. I mean, that's the ambiance of being able to plan a trip like that. Yeah.
Now we're all, as pilots, we're just naturally intrigued and drawn to the weather, and certainly you by now you understand what type of weather conditions or hazards might be represented by approaching cold fronts or warm fronts or low pressure systems versus high pressure systems. But I can tell you, it seems like inevitably as pilots we can fall into what I like to call this METAR radar trap, where those seems to be the only tools we gravitate towards to get a picture of the weather. And gosh, there's so much more, and there's been new products that have been launched in recent years, and so many of these are available graphically to give you a better understanding than just those older days of getting an area forecast and having to try to plot out the various VORs or airports that encompass this box of potential weather. So, I would encourage you to broaden your horizons. Is that a good term that we should use, Les, for exploring weather?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of weather products out there, especially with the apps, and it really makes life a lot easier. And the big picture aspect of what you're about to discuss is really available a lot more than it was when I started in GA.
So we certainly in the training environment advocate for starting with the big picture and then kind of creating that funnel down to more targeted or more specific observations as opposed to forecast. And what's great and very intuitive about so many of these new resources that you have access to now, and making this a little bit easier, is that you don't have to again, we're talking about reinventing the wheel. It's not necessary, because so many of these applications, online or dedicated apps, lay the information out in a very logical sequence, and they do this very thing. They start with those big picture weather products. So there's still nothing wrong with, several days in advance of your trip, We probably all do it in aviation. You know, the TV weather's okay, get a general sense of how closely I'm going to need to watch the weather, or hey, this looks very solid VFR, you know, on either day, either side of my trip. But getting those, you know, kind of getting a sense of what the trends are doing. And again, these apps, online apps, dedicated apps will lead you in this direction. Start with some of those big picture products. You know, the surface analysis is one, of course, that gives you that general sense of where the pressure systems are, where the fronts are going to be, so you have an idea of, you know, where the weather might be that I will have to contend with. Certainly in the springtime, down in the south, thunderstorms, you know, thunderstorms in light airplanes or any airplane certainly don't mix. So the, you know, convective outlooks and convective forecasts, which have gotten much more accurate over the years, those are something that are, you know, you're going to want to include in that that toolbox of sorts when you're evaluating weather. The convective outlooks now, and unless, in my opinion, you know, Les, you've been studying the weather a lot longer than I have, but I, you know, from my perspective, and you know, they certainly have gotten more accurate. They're not 100% ever, of course, but they extend these convective outlooks out now to 72 hours. You know, so I guess I'll kind of get your opinion here on the accuracy of some of this trending weather.
Well, it's hit and miss. You know, I find with cold fronts, they tend to move quicker. But that's about all I'll say with, you know, my expertise or experience level. But yeah, no, it's great to have look. And listen, not only that, it's a great part of being able to plan a trip is that anticipation of, you know, can I go, can I not go, and then looking at the different products. It's the other aspect of the fun of general aviation.
Now, when you get into the forecast realm, which for convective activity is down to that 8-hour time frame, they certainly are going to get a little more accurate there. Unless I'd love to pose and get your thoughts on this particular question. You know, what I find sometimes is we can, you know, with the availability of all this information, it can sometimes work against us a little bit in that pilots will give up too quick. In other words, I spotted in this 2-day or 3-day convective outlook, there could be thunderstorms in my area, so I'm just gonna, you know, cancel the trip, maybe look for something else. So I would certainly, you know, caution against putting too much stock in longer range forecast. Have you seen pilots kind of with that same mentality, Les, that they're just kind of ready to give up, so to speak, if they see an unfavorable forecast?
Well, remember, you know, I come from the mentality of, you know, we're going anyhow. But that being said, you know, when it's your wife that's going in the airplane with you, we tend to overanalyze a little bit, and I tend to be a little extra cautious. You know, I'll cancel a trip before, you know, that something is making me uncomfortable. But you know, listen, once again, it's all about your comfort level. There's nobody in dispatch, or, you know, you don't have 300 people behind you that have to just get there. It's just you, and hopefully you have enough flexibility in your schedule to not worry about those kind of things.
Yeah, I think what certainly can help your confidence and just help your skill and ability to, you know, analyze weather is to really follow through, even if it's just imaginary flights, or even if it's these what if scenarios. You know, follow how those forecasts are trending and actually see it through, see what the actual observations are. You know, for example, this is a look, you know, we likely in this scenario would have seen maybe some forecast convective activity, and this is what's actually happening in the form of a convective segment, which, you know, instead of, again, trying to connect the dots of various fixes or airports, this gives us a real-time look at where the weather actually is. But doing some of those what ifs certainly will help, and also trends. We've mentioned trends several times, but you know, if the trends are all one direction in terms of severity or in terms of coverage, you know, generally you probably put a little more stock in that. I also wanted to just highlight a great new tool that has essentially replaced the area forecast, and that's the graphical forecast for aviation. So this, in my opinion, is one, if you've been away from aviation a little while, or if you're, again, transitioning out of the airline world, you probably haven't looked at. So I would really encourage you to take a look at this product, which you can just search in the Aviation Weather Center. And this allows you to to choose specific altitudes for various information. That's a look at precipitation and weather. There's current ceilings and visibilities, all the green dots being VFR. And when you're talking about looking for an escape or looking for an alternate, boy, this picture's worth a million words right here. You know general direction. Where's my good weather? Where's my marginal weather? Where's that IFR weather? And this is a look at turbulence. And I know less from flying with family or friends. We need to think about turbulence in light airplane flying. And I know you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, this is we want to give everybody a good experience, and we certainly did that with the airlines. But now that we have these products, these weather products, it's really a lot more helpful. I mean, simple things like when you look at a forecast or a METAR, TAF, whatever it is, and it shows scattered clouds. Well, guess what? Those scattered clouds may be at a level that you want to cruise at. So, that now all of a sudden scattered seem like nothing to you in the airlines. It's actually a decision process with your cruise altitude and what you may have to face along the way as far as bumpy air is concerned. But the turbulence forecast goes a little more in depth than that evaluation.
Sure. And then ice, we certainly have to think about potential ice. There are some GA airplanes that are capable of icing conditions, but many more that are not. But again, some great new weather products out there to help you forecast levels of ice and icing severity. So let's turn
that's a great. I'm sorry, Eric. Yeah, one of the biggest fears I notice among a lot of airline pilots is going in an icing condition, and it can be a serious situation. But if you've got that weather product, that's certainly something that would aid in your decision process.
So some en route resources. I want to, this is a topic, Les, that you covered extensively in part 1 of our presentation, which again, I'll point back to the Sporty's webinar archives if you want to take a look at part 1 of transitioning back to propeller airplane flying, but the difference between the weather options you have en route. But the point being is that it doesn't, your weather information or consumption of information and analysis, it doesn't stop at the FBO. Now with ADS-B, now with the Sirius XM options, you can carry that right into the airplane and continue that evaluation throughout the entire flight.
Yeah, absolutely. I have XM. I'll probably never get rid of it, especially for the tunes. So there you go.
It's really easy to get used to. And that being said, if you're one that opts for that ADS-B option, which is the free government-based ground broadcast, and we covered this fairly extensively in presentation 1, you can also get traffic information. So again, this is just another set of eyes and another resource available to you. And in the case of ADS-B, it's all free. And in that same vein, we have the option, even VFR flying, we alluded to this earlier, is taking advantage of air traffic control that's there for us. So in the VFR world, you're certainly not air traffic control's priority, but when you engage in VFR services, and a quick note in the handout section of the GoToWebinar platform, there's a kind of a quick reference card of how you can get VFR services. But ATC can help with routing, they can help with altitudes, they can help with weather. It's not going to be their sole responsibility, but I take advantage of VFR flight following quite a bit. I'm not sure about you, Les.
No, whenever I have an opportunity, if I'm going from point A to point B, I always try to get a hold of the nearest facility. It just makes life easier, unless I'm just sightseeing and there's no need and I'm close to the airport. But no, it's always great to have somebody that you can fall back on, if you've got an abnormal or emergency situation.
I couldn't agree more. Now, as we kind of bring things to a close, Les, and we've kind of gotten through the the primary portion of our contents, a lot of people are probably thinking, a lot we've given them to investigate maybe further, but kind of the fun part of, well, what is my next step? When am I going to the airport? Should I think about a flying club or an airport, or maybe there's some associations that can help? I know you had some thoughts on this as well, and you've had experience with some of these great resources that some of our associations have.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, they're all great suggestions. Somebody that wants to get back into flying, I'd suggest, go rent an airplane. It's the cheapest way to start rather than making a commitment necessarily to a flying club. But a lot of us jump right in, and that's to buying an airplane, and that's the fun part of it. I mean, it's just it's really kind of exciting, and you get passionate about and you become an expert on the airplane that you want. But the important thing is, and then I think your next slide will kind of cover this, and I'll let you fill in the rest. But at the end of the day, is what's your mission? What do you want to do? Do you just want to fly VFR, go in out of grass strips and buy yourself an Radtke Champ or a Cub or something of that nature? Or do you really want to go places? And if you want to go places, how far do you want to go? What are your legs? What can you afford, and so on and so forth. So these are all fun considerations, and buying an airplane is a process, and there's a lot involved with the process, and you don't want to do it with your eyes closed, and there's a lot to it. And I'll let Eric fill in the blanks for the rest of it.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And one element that I see in talking to people, and I talk to a lot of pilots that kind of come down to this decision-making process. Okay, what's the next step? Rental. You made a great point. Les, going out to rent an airplane or going to the local flight school is a great first step. But I'd like to encourage everyone to not get into that mentality that you're kind of alone. It seems like just the nature of aviation and flying. Kind of makes us think or imagine sometimes that we have a lot to do or maintain on our own. And my point being that what we talked about on the last slide, and even now, there's so many great resources out there, from our associations to the local clubs to just your local pilot community. And I know other pilots. We all do. We're a tight-knit community. We're very accepting. We're very open. We're very supportive. So use that to your advantage. I haven't met a pilot yet that didn't love to sit down and talk about flying in airplanes, and just so much knowledge you can gain there from people who have done it before you. So again, I'm back to kind of saying this over and over again, but don't reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of people that have been there, that have had the experience. So find out what others are doing at the airport, what types of airplanes they own, the type of flying they're doing, and that's going to give you some great insight.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. And listen, as airline pilots, we all know that we learn from mistakes, and there's folks out there and I'm not talking about mistakes necessarily in flying, but mistakes in buying certain airplanes, or what they've done with the airplane, how they've maintained it, how they did the pre-buy, and so on and so forth. So other pilots are great resources. Absolutely.
Fantastic. So that time flies. We're kind of through the information again. We certainly hope we've given you a lot of things to think about and investigate further, and hopefully inspire you to get out and go flying. Again, so much great energy. Les, we've had a few of our participants kind of ask about being able to follow up and get in contact with you. I have kind of said within the messaging that I'd be happy to relay messages via the CFI@sportys.com. I'm certainly willing to pass those along. A lot of thank yous, Captain Abend, for your time and your insights, for sure. I think it sounds like we have some people in the Orlando area that maybe want to come by and say hi. I don't know, since you're going to be a regular there at the SimCom facility.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, that's very flattering. I'm very humbled by people actually paying attention to me anyhow. But in any case, yeah, it's great. I hope that you and I have both inspired some of my colleagues, if they haven't already, get involved, and please forward those emails to me, and I'd be glad to answer them.
I will do that. Les, just a ton of fun. I always enjoy the conversation with you. You're a wealth of knowledge and experience, having the distinguished airline career, now being active GA flyer, now back in education day to day and working on the Gulfstream program. Certainly been a pleasure on my part. Any closing thoughts from you, sir?
No, Eric, a pleasure for me as well. I hope to do this again, in some form or another, and let's keep the ball rolling.
Excellent. Well, for Captain Abend, I'm Eric Radtke from Sporty's. And we certainly appreciate you joining us, and everyone fly safe out there. We hope to see you back again sometime very soon. Good night.